Welcome back, Focus Learners. Okay, so today we've got an absolutely incredible explainer lined up for you. We are diving headfirst into a world where engineering logic was just completely thrown out the window, all in favor of sheer logic-defying scale. We're talking about the jaw-dropping ambition of Soviet and Russian design bureaus. I mean, from flying aircraft carriers to literally ground-skimming sea monsters, we're going to explore 13 machines that are so massive, so incredibly strange, you'll kind of wonder how they were ever real.
In fact, when Western intelligence agencies first captured satellite photos of some of these things, they literally thought they were being pranked. The official reaction was that analysts refused to believe their own eyes and suspected a hoax. That is the level of absurdity we're dealing with here. These weren't just big machines. They were these massive steel leviathans that completely defied the laws of physics, aerodynamics, and, well, common sense.
So, here's our roadmap for today's explainer. First, we'll look at the roots of gigantomania. Then, bizarre experiments in aviation. Third, conquering land and sea. Fourth, Soviet sci-fi and UFOs. And finally, the legacy of Soviet ambition.
All right, let's jump right into Section 1, the roots of gigantomania.
So the guiding philosophy behind all this is a concept known as gigantomania. Essentially, this is a state obsession with building structures and machines on an extraordinary and often highly impractical scale. You have to understand, the goal wasn't always efficiency. It was really about demonstrating raw, unbridled power and attempting to conquer totally impossible tasks by just making things bigger. Honestly, if a machine didn't work, the go-to solution was usually just to scale it up.
The Tsar Tank from World War I perfectly illustrates this whole mindset. I mean, the expectation was that by building a machine the size of a 3-story house with these massive 9-meter front wheels, it would just effortlessly roll over enemy trenches like a bicycle rolling over a matchbox. But the reality? Well, it was a spectacular, almost hilarious failure. That tiny little rear roller ended up taking the brunt of the 60-ton weight. So during its very first serious test, it immediately sank deep into the soft mud. No amount of engine power could pull it out, and it literally just sat there rusting in the woods near Moscow until the 1920s when it was finally scrapped for metal.
Moving right along to Section 2, bizarre experiments in aviation. As you might guess, this obsession with size did not stay on the ground for long. 50 meters. That was the staggering wingspan of the Kalinin K-7, designed back in the 1930s. To put that into perspective for you, this flying fortress had a larger wing area than a modern American B-52 bomber, which was built 2 decades later. The wings were actually so incredibly thick that the passenger cabins were built inside of them. It weighed nearly 30 tons and needed 7 massive engines to fly. But tragically, the science of aviation just hadn't caught up to their ambition yet. Engineers couldn't properly calculate the intense vibrations, and the K-7 crashed during a test flight, permanently ending the whole project.
Now, consider a few other bizarre aircraft from this era. First, the Zveno Project. This was basically a flying aircraft carrier. They literally suspended up to 5 small fighter planes under the wings of a heavy bomber. The fighters would feed off the bomber's fuel until it was time to detach and fight. And, ironically, this circus-like contraption was a massive success and actually bombed targets in World War II. Then we have the Antonov A-40, also known as the gliding flying tank. They actually strapped giant biplane wings to a light tank and towed it into the sky. Amazingly, the test pilot landed safely once, thoroughly terrifying the local farmers, but it had to be scrapped because there simply weren't tow planes strong enough to lift it regularly. Finally, check out the MIL Mi-10. This was a flying crane helicopter with 10-meter-tall legs designed to straddle entire buses or small houses, pick them up, and just fly away. Believe it or not, this one flew successfully well into the 21st century for remote construction.
But the sheer absurdity really peaked with the PCL M15, famously known as the Belfagor. Built in Poland for the USSR, the concept here is just baffling. It was a jet-powered agricultural crop duster. Yeah, someone actually thought it was a great idea to use a screaming jet engine to spray fertilizer over farms. It was named after a demon because of its absolutely terrifying roar and otherworldly look. Practically though, it was a disaster, it had awful fuel economy, it was incredibly slow, and had a super short range. Today, it securely holds the historical title of the world's ugliest plane.
Okay, let's shift gears to Section 3, conquering land and sea.
When you look back down at the brutal, unforgiving terrain of the Soviet Union, you run into a massive problem. In endless swamps and deep snow, traditional wheels just don't survive. Enter the ZIL-2901. Engineers completely ditched traditional wheels and replaced them with giant hollow metal screws. By rotating these massive augers, the vehicle would literally screw its way through deep swamps and snow where a normal tank or truck would sink instantly. Legend actually says these were kept specifically to rescue cosmonauts who landed in completely inaccessible areas. The catch? A crawling top speed of barely 15 kilometers per hour. Plus, if you tried to drive it on a paved road, the metal screws would just hopelessly scrape and destroy the asphalt. So, it was a perfect vehicle, as long as you had a world without roads.
But for the times they did have roads and needed to move heavier payloads, the Gigantomania came back with an absolute vengeance. Look at the evolution of the MAZ missile trucks. The logic was simple. Bigger rockets mean more wheels. In the 1950s, we see 8-wheeled giants for early rockets. By the 70s, it's 12-wheeled trucks carrying 60 tons. But by the 1980s, total lunacy. The MAZ 7904 was 30 meters long, with 24 wheels on 12 axles, built for a 200-ton rocket. That is the size of a 6-story building. The cab was so wide the driver and navigator practically needed to mail letters to each other. They tested these monsters in absolute secrecy at night, which actually created local folklore among truck drivers who swore they saw multi-wheeled buildings crawling through the dark.
Now, to understand our next machine, we first need a quick lesson on something called ground effect. Basically, this is an aerodynamic principle where a wing flying very close to a surface, usually water, traps a highly dense cushion of air beneath it. This cushion provides a massive, incredibly stable lift that's way more efficient than normal flight. Well, engineers actually weaponized that physics principle to create the Echronoplan. On paper, the capabilities were absolutely staggering. 100-meter-long hybrid ship planes flying at 500 kilometers per hour. Because they barely touched the water, they were totally immune to sea mines, and flying so low made them completely invisible to traditional radar. This was the exact machine that initially baffled the CIA, earning it the nickname the Caspian Sea Monster. But the reality, the original monster crashed due to pilot error in 1980. Its successor, a 75-meter giant named Loon, equipped with anti-ship missiles, barely even entered service before the Soviet economy collapsed. Today, it just sits there resting as a beached whale on the shores of Derbent, serving as a wildly popular tourist attraction.
Let's move to Section 4, Soviet Sci-Fi and UFOs. So this engineering ambition didn't just stop at skimming oceans, it crossed straight into absolute science fiction. I mean, UFOs were real, they just happened to come out of Soviet design bureaus. First up, the Bartini V VA-14. This was an anti-submarine amphibian that, I kid you not, looked exactly like a ship from Star Wars years before the movie was even a thing. It was designed to skim the water and eventually launch vertically using a dozen lift engines that were never finished. Then, from the 70s, you have the EKIP project. This was a literal flying saucer, a wingless, disc-shaped craft that landed not on wheels, but on a hovercraft air cushion, meaning it could touch down on snow, mud, or water. It was super fuel efficient, but here is the best part. Whenever they ran test flights with the scaled-down prototypes, it actively triggered waves of real UFO sighting reports in all the nearby villages. It's wild. Sadly, despite some interest from the United States in the 2000s, this incredibly efficient saucer was permanently grounded when the economy collapsed.
And this sci-fi obsession definitely extended to their weaponry too. Take the 2B1 Oka nuclear mortar. This tank featured a 20-meter-long barrel designed to fire a 420mm, 750-kilogram nuclear shell. That is a shell heavier than a grand piano. Its fatal flaw? The recoil was so intensely violent that every single time it fired, it would literally tear its own gearbox right off its mountings and destroy its own suspension. Then there's the 1K-17's Shati, which is a literal laser tank right out of a comic book. Instead of a main gun, it had a battery of optical lasers powered by massive 30-kilogram artificial ruby crystals. But contrary to what you'd see in Hollywood, it wasn't built to melt through enemy armor. It was designed to instantly burn out and blind the optics and sensors of enemy vehicles. Ultimately, those ruby-powered internals made it so astoundingly expensive that it was scrapped, and the only remaining prototype was quietly dumped in a museum.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, the legacy of Soviet ambition.
So what is the legacy of all this gigantomania? What actually happens when an empire collapses and leaves these dangerous, colossal monsters behind? Well, looking impartially at modern events shows us the real-world risks of managing these remnants of the atomic era today. Take the terrifying anecdote of the Ekaterinburg near disaster. In December 2011, wooden scaffolding caught fire around a massive nuclear submarine in dry dock.
The terrifying part is that authorities later admitted the sub was still fully loaded with 2 active nuclear reactors, missiles, and torpedoes while the fire raged outside for nearly 24 hours. They had to partially sink the sub just to extinguish the flames. When the damage was finally cleared, the public got a look at its massive, highly classified bulbous sonar dome, which, ironically, looked exactly like a steampunk ship straight out of Disney's Atlantis. It's a pretty stark reminder that while these designs are visually fascinating, the real-world danger they still pose today is incredibly serious.
Well, that brings us to the end of today's explainer. Almost all of these impossible machines ultimately failed. They were either too far ahead of their time, way too complicated, or they simply couldn't survive the collapse of the country that built them. Yet they really do represent an era of boundless, awe-inspiring imagination, a time when engineers truly believed that any problem could be solved if you just built a machine big enough. So I want to leave you with this final, ultimate choice. If you were given the keys today and had to test drive just one of these absolute monsters, would you choose the bone-rattling, gearbox-shattering 2B1 Oka nuclear mortar? Or would you take command of the sci-fi 1K-17 laser tank? Think about it. Thanks for joining me, and keep exploring this fascinating history.